Indeed. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new session of LPCx Barcelona. With me tonight, we have two special guests, Manuel Pais and John Cutler. Welcome, guys, and thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me.
No worries. Our pleasure. And before starting with the session, I'd like to take just a few minutes to present you all who are here, who we are, and what we're doing. So very quickly, especially for those of you who are new, LPC, La Product Conf, is an international community of product people that are sharing their experiences and best practices on product management, product design, product data, and lately also focusing on product engineering. Every year, and of course, pandemics allowing it, we host also 2 annual conferences in both Paris and Madrid, and several other monthly meetups in different cities across France and Europe. For more information on the annual conference and also on the monthly meetups, do not hesitate to subscribe to our meetup groups or eventually follow us on LinkedIn. Before starting, I just want you to make you aware that the event will be recorded so that we can rewatch it and eventually share it afterwards within our network. During the event, you can also use the chat section to post your messages, as well as the question section, where you will be able to post any questions, and we will answer them at the end during the Q&A. And now, without any further ado, I present you the two special guests for today's product discussion. Both of them need no introduction, but for those of you who are new, we have here today with us Manuel Pais, author of Team Topology, DevOps leader, organizational team consultant. He's very focused on team interaction, delivery best practices. He's also an advocate for continuous delivery. And on the other side, today will be our moderator, John Cutler. Is a recognized product leader, keynote speaker, and a very influential person in the product space. In the past, he covered various positions, Zendesk, Pendo, before joining Amplitude as a product coach and head of product education. So welcome, guys.
Yeah, welcome. Thank you so much for having us.
That's it. Yeah, that's it on my side. I'll let you in their hands, and I'll see you later for the Q&A. Enjoy the discussion.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for the intro. Hello, folks. I hope everyone's doing fine. It's probably evening where you are. Manuel, amazing to be able to finally do an event with you. That's exciting.
Yes, definitely.
I wanted to give about 2 minutes of context before Manuel jumps into a talk. The way we're going to structure today is a very brief intro. Manuel's going to jump in to tell us a little bit about team topologies for 25 minutes, 30 minutes, and then we'll leave the floor open for questions. I think there's going to be a lot of questions coming out of Manuel's discussion. I wanted to give a quick background for the motivation for today's talk. I'm pretty involved in the product community, but I also kind of dabble in the DevOps community and Agile community, etc. And one thing I find very fascinating is in the DevOps community, I would argue that there's deeper discussions about organizational design than there are in the product communities. And I've been trying to think about why that's the case for a long time. And my conclusion is because the DevOps community focuses on what I would call like the messiest parts of many organizations. So they've been forced to think about some of these more advanced topics around organizational design and structure. Meanwhile, the product teams, the customer-facing product teams, we're all very excited. We're all very empowered. Like Marty Kagan's book, our world is actually a bit simpler in many ways. Until, of course, you try to grow your organization or grow your product team. So what I was hoping to do for today is actually bring these worlds together a little bit. Manuel's book that he wrote with Matt Skelton is really, it's highly, highly, highly recommended. It's called Team Topologies. You should buy it. My partner is in human resources, and we open it up every day to think about organizational design for her company too. So this is not relegated to DevOps or engineering teams by any means. So Manuel and Matt got this great discussion going. It's a very useful tool in team topologies. What we hope to do today is, after presenting the concepts behind team topologies, is start to explore how this relates to product teams, the world of product. As I mentioned, often it falls on the CTO or an engineering leader to think about these team structure ideas, especially with the non-customer facing teams, right? The platform teams, et cetera. And product is left a little bit to the side for many reasons. We can discuss that later. But what I hope to do today is to kind of bring those worlds together. I would end with one thought. In product, you might have heard of the Spotify model, or you might have heard of Shape Up, or you might have heard of these various people discussing, models for organizing your team. And at least I've always had that suspicion, like, we shouldn't really copy this method. Like, what are the principles behind this? Maybe why did it work? And as Manuel goes through his presentation, I wanted maybe to encourage people to give some special thought to that, how these structures that people seem to copy and paste, like what are the rationales behind them or the reasons behind it? So without further ado, first, get Manuel's book because it's we're only gonna be able to scratch the surface today, but it's very accessible. And yeah, Manuel, I'd love for you to present and kick off our discussion, and then we can resume. I'll turn off my video and go on mute, but I'll let you know if I can't hear you or see you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, John. That was a great introduction, and again, super excited to do this discussion. So I look forward to after the talk to talk with and answer questions. I love the work from John. I reference very often because he goes across the borders between product thinking and DevOps and team dynamics, and it's just fascinating. So I'll do the presentation. Let me share my screen. I'll try to keep it as short as possible, but it's always it takes some time to get into the ideas. So you should be seeing my slides now. Is that correct?
Yep, we
Okay.
see them. Everything looks good.
Perfect. So I'm going to try to explain as briefly as I can what are sort of the organizational patterns and trends that we talk about in team topologies. Very quickly, I have a background in computer science, a more technical background. I've had a number of different roles throughout my career, and very often I was kind of bumping into the problems, issues around organizing teams and dependencies between teams and all these sort of things and problems. And so the book that I wrote with Matthew Skelton really is providing some patterns, some ideas, some thinking tools, if you like, on how can we address some of these problems with the goal of achieving fast flow, right? So organizing the subtitle, organizing business and technology teams for fast flow. So maybe not all organizations need or care about fast flow, but today most organizations need to do that. And so when we talk about fast flow, it's not necessarily just delivering more features or more products and faster. It's actually validating that what we're delivering actually meets the goals of our customers and therefore kind of the bottom line for our organization. Some people have said that, which I think is an appropriate kind of definition, that it provides tools and concepts for structuring different operating models. So it's not a model per se. It's not saying you should have these teams and you should have these roles and this is how teams should work exactly. It's just providing some ideas on what do we need, and based on what we need, what kind of teams would make sense and how should they interact. John mentioned the Spotify model, which, frankly has been, if you look back before the Spotify model, or what became known as the Spotify model, it was much worse if you've been around that long as I have and John. And so it really helped change thinking around many aspects, in particular, encouraging, flow of change, faster flow of change, aligning teams to the business segments or business domains that make sense, clarify a little bit the responsibilities of teams and promote cross-functional teams as well. and also a little bit on promoting good collaboration between teams. And the last point, also quite important, start planning and think about cross-team enablers, cross-team learning when we talk about guilds or chapters. Not just waiting for that kind of learning across teams to just happen, hopefully, but actually being more intentional about that, and actually something that we plan for and we are actively promoting. So all of this and other things were quite influential in the Spotify model, and that's all good. But as John said, we can't just copy a model and expect it to have the same benefits. Even Spotify themselves have done many talks and articles saying we don't have a Spotify model at Spotify. It's just was a snapshot in time, right? Our thinking evolved since then. And so some of the things that we also need to address that are not directly covered by Spotify model or other frameworks for that matter include thinking about trust boundaries, cognitive load for teams, something called Conway's law, and how does that influence how we set up our teams and how the kind of products and systems we can build. How should teams interact? Instead of being sort of very open-ended thing where, yes, it's good to collaborate, and DevOps talks a lot about collaboration, but what exactly is collaboration, and when should it happen? And other types of interactions. And finally, how do we evolve over time? So particularly also for startups or scale-ups, how do we grow over time, and when should we be thinking about changing, right, and evolving from a model we've had until now, which maybe worked quite okay, but now as we grow, probably it's not going to be the best fit. So I'll try to give you an overview of team topologies. Even my own thinking about the book has evolved after about a year and a half that it's been out.
That's not allowed to happen. You're not allowed to change your mind.
No, the book is the Bible, and you need to follow it. No, I've actually it's just my mental model of the book and the ideas as evolved, and it's really, I think this makes sense. It's talking about there are some constraints to the way that we can operate and the organization can work. There are some patterns, which are kind of the things we've introduced to help think about the design of the organization that would be suitable. And then there's the aspect of sensing for evolution, right? When should we be looking at changing and maybe rethinking our teams, our team responsibilities, etc. And finally, the fact that it provides, and that has been one of the key things that people have taken away, is having now this language to talk about organization design, right? Not just teams in general. There are many different types of teams, right? So we can now talk about that in a much more meaningful way with kind of clear language. And so let me go through these four aspects in terms of operational constraints. These are things that I'm talking here about, kind of constraints that are not easy, are not changeable, right? Of course, there are constraints that we can address and we can try to remove or minimize, but there are also constraints basically from the fact that we are humans, and so there are certain things that and ways of behaving that don't really change. And so one of them is trust boundaries. So maybe many of you are familiar with the work of Robin Dunbar and something called Dunbar's number, right? So he is an anthropologist, and he found out any individual's social network in terms of meaningful relationships with other people. So not necessarily how many friends you have on Facebook, but those that you actually have a relationship with that is meaningful, is typically between 100 and 200. And so people talk about Dunbar's number as 150. That's sort of a limit in how many people can we even interact with in a way that makes sense, right? That we know how this other person is related to us, and how the work we do is related as well. But there are other trust boundaries that Dunbar found. And so this means basically the smaller the group that you're part of, the higher the trust, right? Because people can have deep trust inside a team of between 5 and 15 people, perhaps, usually 7 plus minus 2, but in some cases can go up to 15 people in a team. But that's where you have the faster flow. Even that's where you can make decisions faster, where you can have deep trust between people and have more higher performance and more productive teams. And then there are other boundaries. So around 50, there's a boundary, and around 150, so Dunbar's number, and then 500. But basically, if we want to achieve more and go faster and be able to deliver and respond to market, to customers faster, we need to focus more on the smaller groups, right? Have teams that are empowered, as Martin Kagan says, and are autonomous as much as possible. But because products tend to be larger than what one team can work on by themselves, then start thinking about the limit around 50, right? So that's probably 7 to 8 teams, something like that. That's probably what makes sense in terms of teams working together on the same product or closely related products, right? So this starts to give us clues as how do we organize a larger company in a way that we promote high trust and we promote fast flow. And this is something that I don't see very often, especially even scale-ups thinking about this. So maybe some of you have been through this, where the startup becomes much bigger and then starts to replicate the models that they see in large organizations, and so that's often leads to not being able to deliver as fast, a lot more kind of processes being introduced and more dependencies between teams. And so that 50 boundary is quite important. Of course, it's not an exact number, but between 30, 40, 50 people, things start to change. And then 150 is as well. So that's one sort of constraint. There are these trust boundaries that we need to be aware of, and we should be thinking about organizational structures to match those trust boundaries as well. Another constraint is team cognitive load. So cognitive load at an individual level is defined as total amount of mental effort being used in the working memory. So people who are familiar or work in user experience tend to think about cognitive load for the users to use our product, right? How much effort does the user need to actually understand how to go through a certain workflow or get some task done, and how can we minimize that? So what we talk about is cognitive load applied to teams. So teams have a limit on their mental capacity as a group, right? So if especially successful teams tend to be victims of their own success because they're asked to do more and more, and we don't think about there's a limit. At some point, we can't ask them to do more without kind of the quality and the speed to going down, sometimes dramatically. And also cognitive load, there are different types of cognitive load. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but basically the germane cognitive load is everything around the actual business domain or the problem space. What are the things we're trying to solve for? And so any kind of knowledge and things that we need to have in mind around that problem space and the solution space are the germane. And other things like the tooling, the frameworks, all the kind of the mechanics that need to happen are sort of extraneous cognitive load. And intrinsic is more related to the skills we need to do our job. So essentially, we want to maximize the germane because that's where we're actually building the added value in our products and our systems, so that the customers, are happier, can do their job easier, and can get more value from our products. So understanding this also means we start thinking about ways to minimize the other types of cognitive load. Another constraint is Conway's law. So I don't know if people are familiar. This is a sort of a modern version, I think a more direct version of Conway's law from Ruth Mallon. She's an enterprise architect. And she says, if the architecture of the system and the architecture of the organization are at odds, if they're very different, the architecture of the organization wins. And so Conway's law was written by Mel Conway, or was part of a paper he wrote in 1968. So I highly recommend you have a look into that if you're interested. But this is kind of the bottom line, right? So what does this mean? It means that the way we design the organization is already placing constraints on the solutions we can find, right? Because the systems that we build are going to be a reflection of the organization, of our teams, and the communication paths between different teams. And so being aware of this is quite important, right? It means we need some kind of organization design, but if we're aware of this, then we understand what are the constraints, what are the limitations we're putting on the kind of products and systems we can find. At some level, it's almost like the organization design is your top level system architecture design, right? And so you already kind of set yourself up in certain ways, and so what you can achieve is constrained by that. And that also means HR departments, if they are making decisions in isolation around how to organize teams, they are accidentally shaping the architecture of the systems and the products as well, which is something kind of mind-blowing for many people. And when we say here HR departments, of course, in some organizations might be senior managers to make decisions around or which teams should we have in the organization. Whoever is making those decisions, if they are made sort of in isolation compared to the technical decisions around software architecture, then we might have a strong mismatch, right? We're trying to build some stuff in a certain way, but the way we've organized teams has not taken that into consideration. And so it's not that we can't achieve that, but it's probably going to cost a lot more. And it's going to involve a lot more kind of dependencies between teams, possibly a lot more communication between teams than we would like to achieve fast flow. So once we understand the constraints, we can look at what are some useful patterns, right? So this is, let's say, the core of team topologies. What are the patterns that can help? I actually have a talk called Product Teams Need a Family Too, which, it's a bit more, goes into more detail, but it's actually, the title is bringing to light the idea that, yes, we want to have empowered product teams, but that's not enough, right? So the idea of high-performing teams, we cannot just think of teams in isolation. What we need is more of a team of teams, right? And in the past, people have rightly sort of been burned, if you like, or negatively impacted by this sort of approach that you see here, where if we organize teams in a way that they depend on each other to execute the work, and we have all these handovers between development and test team and, I don't know, data analytics team, we cannot achieve fast flow. This is going to be very slow. We have all these handovers, we have all this knowledge that gets lost when we have these transitions between different teams, right? So before Spotify model, this was sort of the traditional way that teams are organized, and we know this doesn't work well, and this is not a good fit for modern software and product development. So instead, we would like product teams, or stream-aligned teams, as we call them. So we call them stream-aligned because you might have multiple teams within the same product, right? Because products tend to be too large for a single team. And so we call them streams. So we can identify streams of work inside the product. Those might be along user personas or user journeys, etc. But anyway, the sort of type of responsibility we would like to have in this team is having end-to-end ownership of a service or a stream, right? So the work never leaves this team, ideally. So they will be in a good position to take feedback and act upon that feedback from the live system and from customers and rapidly address that. This is what we want. This is the starting point for team topologies as well. And when we talk about empowered teams and autonomous teams, this is sort of what we're talking about. But again, this is not enough. And so this is not enough, and this is not good, right? So what do we do instead? And that's where we introduced the idea of 4 fundamental types of teams: the stream-aligned that we already saw, and then 3 other types of teams: enabling, complicated, subsystem, platform team. So enabling teams are usually a small team of experts in some domain. Let's say could be machine learning, could be data analytics, could be continuous delivery, whatever it is, that are helping the stream-aligned teams sort of upskill and have a much shorter learning curve, right? Instead of leaving those teams to their own devices to learn and improve, we're having dedicated teams, enabling teams to help them. The last one is platform team, as John mentioned. So when we think about cognitive load, if we leave it up to the stream-aligned team to take care of the whole stack of tools and technology, infrastructure, etc., that's going to be a lot of cognitive load, a lot of extraneous cognitive load in particular. So when we can abstract some of those things in a platform, which is provided as a set of services, we reduce that cognitive load to a large extent. And finally, complicated subsystem teams, we actually don't actively recommend, but there are some situations where, let's say you have face recognition subsystem, or you have a financial trading reconciliation subsystem, where because of cognitive load, we cannot just give it to a product team and say, well, you take care of this subsystem plus everything else that is customer facing. It's just too much. And so when you need a dedicated sort of full-time team for this subsystem that is very complicated or very niche, then that's sort of a trade-off we have to accept. But in general, we should avoid the complicated subsystem teams. And then we talk about 3 interaction patterns. So again, not just, and then in our experience, interactions is where even if we have clear types of teams, we know what team's mission is, they cannot usually deliver value by themselves to the customers, right? Like I said, usually a product requires multiple teams, and you require other platform teams to provide kind of the low-level services and so on. So how do we think about interactions between teams in a much more intentional way? So we talk about collaboration as 2 teams discovering a possible solution to a problem that needs a solution for a dedicated period of time. So it's not open-ended. It's not the relationship between 2 teams. It's saying, maybe we need to work together for 2 weeks to find out, what would be a good API for this service. Or, how do we remove this dependency where we depend on you to do the deployments for us, and instead we want to be more empowered. We want to be able to do that ourselves. So that's collaboration. X as a service is very much like infrastructure as a service, but for the internal platform. So anything that we provide as a service to the stream-aligned teams, so they can do their work with less cognitive load, right? So if we can have deployments as a service, provisioning as a service, and maybe even higher level kind of services, that would be very helpful. And then facilitating, where one team is helping another one upskill or gain some knowledge around some domain where they're maybe lagging behind a bit. So that's usually the core interaction pattern for enabling teams. But it can happen, for example, if you have a startup, maybe you don't have enabling teams, but you can have a more senior team facilitating a more junior team, right? So we dedicate time to actually address the gaps in the junior team. Maybe they need to understand better our product architecture, or they need to understand better how our CI/CD pipelines work, whatever it is. So these patterns, even if you are a small organization, thinking about this interaction patterns can be quite useful. Even for a platform, maybe we don't have a platform team because we're too small, but maybe we have a couple of senior engineers who are thinking about what is our platform, what is the kind of the small number of services that maybe we use from AWS or Google Cloud, and how do we use them in a way that it helps to guide the other teams in terms of making their life easier and reducing cognitive load. So it's really the thinking about this, even if we don't have the dedicated teams. And so with these sort of patterns, the team types and interactions, we can also start have sort of a landscape view of our organization or part of the organization, right? So with these kind of diagrams that you see here, where we understand we have a couple of stream-aligned teams and they're working on this sort of product or streams, and we have an enabling team, maybe they're helping with learning about some test automation or some other domain. And we have a platform team that's maybe providing a service for provisioning or CI/CD or whatever it might be. So it gives us first a view of where we are now, what's happening, what are the interactions, and what are we trying to achieve. And then we can also use this to think ahead. And what else do we need? Maybe we're going to need an enabling team around data analytics or around continuous delivery. And so it helps us think about how we grow, how do we address the gaps that we have today. So it's not about kind of head count and just recruiting more people because we have more work to do. It's actually being more mindful about what exactly are the gaps, why do we need more people, and what are we trying to learn about and empower teams by providing the right level of support that they need, whether that's with platform services or enabling teams or even a complicated subsystem. There are more patterns and things that are addressed in team topologies, though I can't cover everything today. But I want to mention that for fast flow, really, and the team types interactions, one of the key things we're trying to do is move away from blocking dependencies, those handoffs between different teams, right? We want to empower teams that we still have dependencies on other teams because those will never go away, but those dependencies should be non-blocking as much as possible. So that means if we have a platform providing services, they should be self-service, right? It's not a platform where we make a request to another team to create some environment for our application. No, it's a platform where we are able to do that ourselves via the platform service. And for any kind of dependencies between teams, we want to move away from blocking dependencies to this sort of non-blocking dependencies. Again, when we look at this, we see there are interactions between teams, but ideally those interactions are not along the actual work, are not along the executing, a feature, creating a feature or doing some changes to the product. No, those interactions are along providing capabilities, providing services that are useful for the stream-aligned teams. Like I said, there are other patterns and things we talk about in the book. Also, if you look at teamtopologies.com/tools, we have some useful kind of templates and techniques to do some of these things. Another key idea from Team Topology is to start applying product management to internal platforms. So those platforms I'm talking about, we need to think about them as a product, not as a mandatory set of services, shared services for teams to use, because that doesn't set the right incentives, right? So the platforms in themselves should be internal products. And we need to think about the experience for the engineers to use that platform, right? If we're just might be trying to help with some platform services, but the experience is not good, this is actually increasing cognitive load, right? Instead of helping them, now we have more to worry about. We have to understand how this complicated platform service works or find a workaround because it doesn't meet our needs. So that's not what we want. We want the platform as a sort of curated experience where we apply product management, we apply user experience to the platform. There are some really good examples of organizations who have done this. So we publish them on teamtopologies.com/examples. In particular, USwitch, they just gave a talk a couple of days ago, their CTO, Paul Ingalls, and it's quite impressive. So in the last 10 years, they've been able to increase revenue growth by 600% and increase flow 700 times. Obviously, Team Topologies wasn't around 10 years ago, but what he said is that the principles are basically the same as they were already applying. And now with Team Topologies, it even helped them accelerate even more because now they have this shared language. And finally, it's also about triggers and thinking about when do we need to evolve and how, right? And so again, not thinking about all the teams as just another team, right? There are different types of teams with different missions that we should think about. We need to think about enabling as also kind of sense making and sense checking to see where we have maybe gaps that are not being addressed, things that we need help from the platform, etc. And we might have awkward team interactions as well, where we thought we were going to collaborate to find, a common solution, and then things went weird and we didn't find a solution. Those are fine. Those are signals that actually maybe there's something else we need to do first, or we need maybe help from an enabling team before we can actually collaborate. We just use that as sort of making sense as sensors to what we need to do and evolve. And obviously, we need to be aware of how the ecosystem inside and outside the organization is changing. So we see what we need next. Maybe we need help to adopt more machine learning, artificial intelligence. And so what is our capability today? What do we need to do to increase that and improve? But effectively, organizations need a lot more situational awareness. And if not, what might happen is that those constraints we saw earlier kind of become silent killers of growth, right? If we're just growing, increasing number of people in the organization, and we're not aware of the trust boundaries being crossed, we're not aware of Conway's law playing a role in what we can achieve, and teams being overloaded with cognitive demand, then we think we're growing because we have more people, but actually we're going slower and not able to deliver as we did before. And finally, really, team topology is the main thing that people say it's helpful for them is to have this shared language for organization design and these common patterns and understanding the constraints. So we can then talk better about what we need to do to address the gaps we have. So many people have mentioned that it's like a domain language for organization design. Other people have said it really helps think about operational growth because we now have these better patterns to talk about that. Some people, you might know the book Accelerate as well. So these 3 books are all from IT Revolution. And especially for large organizations, this can be quite helpful to think about. Accelerate talks about high-performing teams from more an engineering perspective. Project to product is about why organizing around projects is not helpful in the long run, and then team topologies for the organization design aspects. And team topology is also based on solid engineering and socio-technical principles, and so it's been adopted very sort of eagerly, I would say, by engineers and architects because they see now that those messier parts around how do we organize teams and people can be leveraged and can be thought about also with the same sort of principles that we do for engineering, right? So if you think about Conway's law, it's basically saying when we grow systems, we need to think about how we grow the teams at the same time and vice versa, right? Finally, just a bunch of resources. I'm sorry I went over a bit the time I had, but we have infographics if you want to share and kind of have a very quick overview, other resources on teamtopology.com. And now we have an academy. We actually have, the first course is Team Topologies Distilled, and there's a 10% discount through the summer. And if you want news about team topologies, we don't send out emails very often. We probably should send more often. But anyway, teamtopologies.com is basically the kind of the key resource if you want to find out more. Sorry, John, I went.
No problem. I'm like fascinated. I'm furiously taking notes. That's really funny. And I'm just going to laugh because Sharon came in just at the slide where it says that HR are the accidental org designers. And then she was, this is our ongoing joke about the book on how to do things. So we have a fair number of questions. Let's split this up a little bit. I think it might work. I'm curious about your thoughts on this. why I can understand why the engineering orgs have embraced some of these ideas maybe a little bit earlier. But I'm interested in discussing with you maybe your thoughts on why, the business or product hasn't yet. And I'm willing to exchange some ideas. I have some, but I was wondering if you had a thought immediately.
Well, I'll probably ask John Cutler, but my ideas. So, like I said, I have more engineering background. I'm not sure. I think obviously there's a lot to think about in terms of product development, product management, which it's also an area which has changed a lot over the last decade at least.
Yeah.
And so I think we're now at a much better point in terms of understanding customers, having the data and analytics, thinking about experimenting and validating things rather than just, let's build these features. Many organizations still do sort of feature factory, as you call them, but I think we're in a much better place around that, and there's a lot to kind of take in. And if we think about Scrum and Agile, again, they brought a lot of useful new ideas and thinking, but as with everything, it also had some drawbacks in terms of people now, thinking about, well, the product owner makes all the decisions about what we should build, and everyone else in the team just follows those decisions, or even people outside the team decide what the team should build. And so unfortunately, those have led to some ways of organizing and thinking that are not, I think, conducive to fast flow of change in the sense of validated change, right? It's not just delivering features. And so I think we're at maybe a crossroad where there's this sort of kind of parallel tracks where a lot of progress has been done on product management, and a lot of progress has been done in terms of engineering thinking around team organizations and everything I talked about earlier. And I think people like you are kind of making the bridge between them and kind of helping think, product management is also about how we organize teams in a way that allows for fast flow. Is also about thinking about internal products and platforms, how they support the external facing product teams, right? Or streamline teams.
That resonates. I mean, I was a product manager for an internal product at Zendesk, and I would actually argue that product managing, an internal platform or any of the models that you mentioned is maybe an order of magnitude harder. I mean, it was certainly, I've done like this customer facing type products, and those are difficult in their own way, but balancing the dynamics in the organization and trying to understand where things are moving. And like you said, not being just a ticket taking platform, but being a true platform and running multiple. Now in retrospect, thinking about my team, we were probably running many different topologies at once. And that was part of the problem, just even a shared language around, we're acting more as sort of search expertise as a service now. And now we're operating as, Elasticsearch maintenance as a service for the rest of the organization. Those two things are very, very different, to do those things.
I often recommend clients, get your most experienced product people in the platform teams, because that's where they need more help. Because traditionally they were not thinking about this idea of the platform as a product. Right. And both what they were providing, this ticket-based response is not helpful, is not conducive to fast flow, or imposing some services that every team must use, even though they're not a good match for their use cases, or the usability is very poor. So all those kind of sort of wrong incentives, I would say. And so thinking about platform as a product kind of changes a lot of things, because now we're talking about, product is voluntary to use, right? We're not going to force this on teams. If they need something else, if they are really autonomous and empowered, they should have the decision making to use something else. So we need to provide a platform and show that the platform is helpful. And so there's a lot of much better kind of alignment when we think about the platform as a product, both for the users and internally, because platform teams typically were so overloaded with doing support, responding to tickets, and trying to build tools and trying to respond to operational issues, and their cognitive load is over the
I mean, you
over
meet
the
with
top
teams. I think I was talking
without more clarity.
with Gene about that, about how the difference in just mental energy that's available to even think from a systems perspective. You've got a team, and I think this is where product is sometimes not to blame necessarily, but they choose to be a little bit purposely ignorant or pay a little less attention. They want their thing, they want their team, they've got their customer facing thing. Meanwhile, there's another team that's trying to support them in one way or another, but that team is viewed as being in the way, versus being in the thing. I think I wanted to jump to some of the questions just to make sure we get to some of them. And I think so some of these are interesting. So Erson asks, how does team topologies help with org scaling? For example, is there an evolution scaling patterns, like use more of these interactions and less of those team types at certain points in scaling? Great question.
Yeah, there are a few kind of, let's call them aspirational goals. Ideally, we have mostly streamlined teams, right? And we have platform teams and some enabling teams, perhaps.
Yep.
That's kind of our aspiration, that we have mostly streamlined teams, or product teams, if you want to call them like that, with all the skills they need to, very quickly make changes, deploy, and deliver value to customers, and using the platform to kind of reduce cognitive load. But in practice, we need more than that. Usually we need kind of sort of evolution towards that. The other thing is, in terms of interactions, there are some, what we call in the book, kind of primary interaction modes for certain types of teams. So in particular for platform teams, for example, we'd expect them, because we're treating the platform as a product, it's the same thing as an external facing product, right? We need to understand the customers, the internal teams. We need to talk to them. We have that benefit that they are in the same organization. So we don't have the excuse that, we don't know who the customers really are. And so we need to, as a platform team, to kind of alternate between collaboration. So we're collaborating with the users to understand what they need, what is the simplest solution that's going to help them, and providing a service. So more kind of the X as a service interaction, where we're focusing on ensuring the service is reliable, is scalable, has adequate documentation and training, etc. So that would be our expectation as sort of ongoing interactions for platform. And for enabling teams is mostly facilitating, but also with the view of, we are enabling teams in a very good position to kind of detect the gaps, right? Where they might see, actually, if we had a platform service or feature that would help teams do this thing more easily, it would be really beneficial.
One thing that comes to mind with that too is, at least the pattern I'm thinking, Erson, is that I think orgs have tendencies one way or another. And some orgs seem to, as they scale, are biased towards premature convergence all the time. Lock down the platform team, make the decision, do et cetera. And it seems like some other organizations are biased in the other direction. They delay any kind of, oh my God, that extra structure, that extra words, can't we just figure it out? Can't we remain in that sort of facilitatory enabling mode for a while? And I think that one pattern I've noticed is you kind of have to figure out what your organization is biased towards, and then think about debiasing that. So for the organizations that always want to lock it down, have an official team, have a process 100% in place, et cetera, early, you have to figure out how to delay that, be more exploratory, be more discovery-based, be more facilitatory. And in the organizations, if you're biased to the, let's just figure it out, why don't we just figure it out kind of things, you need to be maybe try to shift that bias a little bit to, are there opportunities to create, services to enable people? So that would be one bit of advice I'd give, because it certainly is a big spectrum in terms of how organizations think about this problem.
Yeah. I think that's interesting, because Erson's next question was about the Kinetic Framework. And I think it's a bit related to what you just said, John, because if we understand that we're in this complex environment where it's not as predictable or is not predictable, and often we need to make decisions without being able to have direct correlation if this is going to be if we have this effect because of these decisions, and that's kind of the world we need to sort of navigate, and therefore we need to kind of keep an open door to make decisions, and not lock in everything very early. And that's exactly what we talk about with team topologies. And interestingly, Dave Snowden is a, I don't know if a big fan, but he's a supporter of team topologies, because I'm not sure Dave Snowden is a big fan of anything, but because there's very, very strong ideas, which is great. But he likes team topologies, I think, because it again provides patterns, right? We're not saying this is the model and you need these teams and you need these roles specifically. We're saying think about the types of teams and interactions and how they're going to evolve over time.
Yep. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and I think that's a great point, a good segue into the Kinetic Framework too, because I think that's maybe in those organizations that have that bias to premature convergence, it's sort of, they're treating these as very basic systems, maybe while they're still emergent and very complex to do those things.
Treating them as more predictable than they are.
More predictable than they were. Because I think that's my experience too, at least in larger organizations or observing them, is that just the shared language is so important, because, an executive sees 4 people and they think they're doing something for the whole organization. And in their mind, they're thinking, oh, we can reduce the costs. That's great. Only 4 people can help the whole organization. And then meanwhile, if it's some kind of specialized function as a service, that could be amazingly valuable for the organization. To get the best people in the world to try to work on those 4 people could be incredibly powerful for the organization. And so I think this is where shared language is very important, because you can say it a million times, but the executive will see 4 people doing all this work. And I think what you said about success breeds a level of, well, if they can do it with 4 people, why would we need 6 people? Like, it's a solved problem to do it. So I think that's something to think about. Looking at some of the questions, what's your take on growing? So Mbaya asks, what's your take on growing the headcount of a team and splitting it as a strategy to reducing cognitive load? So like, at what point do you just say there's too many people around and we have to split? I'm thinking of also Heidi Helfand's work around dynamic reteaming there. Like, what pattern is the scaling pattern of splitting people?
I would say what are we trying to achieve, right? And actually, when you think about cognitive load, in some cases we can reduce it. Often what we're doing is moving it around. So
it's distributing it. Yeah.
Yes, in a better way. Exactly. That's exactly it. Because when a Streamline team or product team is spending, and the case study from USwitch is very good around this, where they had very strong autonomous teams. They didn't have a platform, but those teams over time were spending 70-80% of the time worrying about AWS services, worrying about infrastructure and tooling, etc. And they didn't have enough time to focus on the actual service they were providing to customers. And so those kind of concerns, when you have a platform team, they're being shifted to the platform and away from the Streamline teams. And that's not bad, because that becomes the germane cognitive load for the platform team, right? So if we think about, let's say, infrastructure provisioning, that is extraneous cognitive load for a Streamline team. Is something they have to do if they don't have help, which is going to take up their effort. But for a platform team that is providing infrastructure as a service internally, that is their germane cognitive load. That's what their kind of product is about, and their service is about. And so we get teams that are focusing on the right things, on the germane cognitive load. And then part of, I didn't really mention the talk, but obviously we want to be on a regular basis thinking about what are the services that we provide, and do those still make sense or not. And that's both inside the platform and outside. So for external facing products, we should be thinking about, and do we have the understanding of what are the services that we provide to customers that are valuable? And when we talk about monoliths, it's often, yes, a bit technical, but it's often a business monolith. It means that we just grew and grew, and we didn't think about what can be independent services. And the same for the platform. What are the independent services? So instead of thinking in terms of headcount and do we need more people or less people, we're thinking about, okay, what are the services that make sense? And maybe there are some services we can get rid of. They're not really needed.
I love that framing, because I think that that's like I can certainly imagine, I've talked to organizations that just imagine that this is like that their organizational design decisions are a direct function of just the number of people they have. Oh, well, we've got 10 more people, therefore we need to do X. But I love your point there that it's actually, structure should follow strategy, right? And it's not, I think this happens a lot in startups that just have arbitrary hiring goals, where because they added 50 engineers in the last quarter, the primary driver of organizational decisions is actually absorbing those people versus thinking about what the structure should be to do it. So I think that's good.
Even in large organizations where often there's the thinking that the only way we can address some gap or some need is by hiring more people. And first of all, it tends to be a lengthy process, right? So your ability to evolve is constrained by that. If it takes even, I don't know, 6 weeks, might even be a very optimistic timeline to
and then there's onboarding, by the way, then the next 6 months to onboard the person. So you might as well think of, if your platform team that provides onboarding capabilities is not working well, then that 6 weeks is more like 6 weeks, 6 months.
and so headcount is really thinking about scaling as in a linear fashion, right? Oh, we need more people, and you can actually achieve. It's not easy, obviously, but you can try to achieve more exponential growth without growing headcount. And there's some good examples. The one I mentioned from USwitch, where with a small platform team, they've been able to reduce a lot of the cognitive load on their stream teams, which now have a lot more focus. And so you saw that number, that kind of 600% increased revenue in 10 years. And they didn't really. They've been growing in headcount, but more or less stable. I think they have around 150 people or something, and they've been around for 15 years. So it's not like what you would expect. Oh, they've been growing so much, so they must have now 500 people. No. There are other examples. For example, in the book, there's an example from a company called OutSystems, where sometimes by rethinking the teams, you can actually achieve a lot more without increasing headcount. So that in their case, they had an engineering productivity team, which what happened was they had too many responsibilities. They were helping with test automation, CI/CD, infrastructure provisioning. And just by splitting that team into smaller teams, which each of them then had much clearer purpose and more feeling of autonomy and being able to make good decisions, was almost from one day to another, they saw the positive impact. And so you need to hire people, obviously, but it doesn't have to be this linear approach that, to grow even our revenue to double it, we need to double the number of people. That's not what we should be thinking about.
So we're at time. Alessandro, I know if what I was thinking is maybe you could copy the questions we didn't get around to. There's a lot of good questions here. Manuel, I wanted to thank you for doing this. I think this is a very fruitful area of collaboration, because I think that a lot of product people are fairly oblivious to this, or they hear the engineering parts of their organization trying to negotiate what you're talking about, and they stay a little bit to the side, hoping, that I just need my team. I need my team for my product. So I think this is a very important area that we need to bridge this divide. So Alessandro, thank you so much for having us. Hopefully this was interesting for you.
Thank you guys a lot. That was very enriching, honestly. I personally learned a lot, and I guess everyone else had lots to think about and to take a new approach to thinking about new team topology. So thanks a lot.
Your team is the product. That's what I want to say. There's the product and then the team that makes the product. So maybe the product is about the whole product versus just your product.
I want to thank you as well for having me, and maybe we would have liked to answer more questions. Maybe we can do another session some point. Now that we've did the presentation, we can have more time for questions. And I think, like you said, John, just bridging this kind of divide is really useful. And just to say, historically, there have been reasons why people are kind of trying to stay away from depending on or other teams to provide things for them. But there are better ways that we can think about, and so hopefully we'll get to a more kind of a middle ground that makes sense.
Yep. Awesome. Yes.
Thanks everyone once again.
I agree. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, have a great evening. Manuel was sitting in Portugal by the beach, and on your vacation, you came in, so that was good. So, okay, bye everyone.
Enjoy your holidays.
Bye.
Thanks for being here.
Bye.
See you.
Bye, John. See ya.
Bye.